I love NATO. I really do. I mean, NATO is the reason why me, a guy from Lithuania, a post-Soviet state, is not involved in any kind of defensive war against imperialistic Russia. Indeed, Russia either directly attacked or at least destabilized basically all their post-Soviet neighbors. Except, of course, us, Baltic states. Reason? Being EU and NATO member. For that, we will be eternally grateful for the combined military might of NATO. One way or another, Russia has the mentality of a street thug, and only language thugs understand is power. However, recently there were some disturbances in NATO, which were mainly centered around some very sharp claims Donald Trump made on multiple occasions, from doubting necessity of NATO to openly inviting Russia to invade those NATO countries that don't match his personal arbitrary criteria who is worthy of US protection. All this stirred the European part of NATO quite heavily, prompting numerous high-ranking European politicians to go on the record by either condemning Trump or even openly discussing what NATO would look like without direct USA involvement. Looking from a conventional perspective, it is borderline apocalyptic for the NATO as we know it today. Nevertheless, I think that all this situation is actually a true blessing in disguise. To understand why, we need to go back to the founding of NATO in 1949. The main goal of NATO was to protect Europe from possible continued aggression of Russia that, at the time, had a form of Soviet Union. I say at the time because throughout the centuries, Russia assumed multiple different names and forms like empire or federation, yet their imperialistic ambition basically never vanished. This was quite a problem for Europe at the time, as in the late 40s it was just starting to recover from the biggest conflict in Europe since 30 Years' War. Putting it bluntly, at the time, Western Europe had no chance to defend itself from seemingly imminent Soviet aggression. Luckily, Soviet Union at the time pretended to be a communist state, putting it in direct confrontation with the capitalistic USA. Due to this confrontation and the USA wanting to preserve rules and democracy-based world order, NATO was born. The main goal of the organization? To prevent possible Russian onslaught on recovering post-war Western Europe. Quick side note. As mentioned, NATO was founded in 1949 as protective shield from possible Russian aggression. Meanwhile, Warsaw Pact, a Soviet-Russia equivalent consisting of reorganized Eastern European puppet states, was formalized only in 1955 as an answer to the NATO. So, anyone claiming that NATO was founded as a counter to Warsaw Pact and lost its purpose after former collapse got it backwards and have no idea what they are talking about. I am looking at you, Musky Boy, and all of his die-hard fans. Regardless, decades came and went, and while capitalistic Western Europe managed to rebuild their economies and militaries, Soviet Union and their puppet regimes went into decades-long decline. All of it resulted in the Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union imploding in late 1980s, with full decommunization finishing in 1990s. And, remarkably, this is where the problems of modern NATO start. You see, with the dissolution of Soviet Union and a lot of former Warsaw Pact and some former Soviet states joining NATO, it seemed that the primary purpose of NATO, keeping Russia in check, vanished. Of course, there were always peacekeeping missions and war on terror, but for Europe the primary threat was seemingly gone. They were now friends with Russia, right? Subsequently, it resulted in most Western European countries slashing their military budgets to the minimum and basically disarming. Meanwhile, the USA, which to be fair also decreased its military spending, never fully disarmed and maintained sufficient military to preserve rules-based world order. Funnily enough, for this excessive military spending, it was critiqued numerous times by self-righteous pacifist cucks from Western Europe and even some intellectuals within USA itself. The problem with all of this was that while the last iteration of Russian Empire was dead, Russia itself was not really defeated or destroyed. Like multiple times in their history, as soon as they got their stuff together, they immediately started rearming and threatening their neighbors. Eastern Europe tried to warn the world about it, but was told off. No escalation. We need to find compromise. We can negotiate. Russia is a part of Europe. These were the phrases we in Eastern Europe were told time and time again. After both Chechen wars, after 2008 invasion to Georgia, even after Crimean annexation and all the Russian barbarism in Syria. Western Europe was in complete denial of true Russian intentions of restoring their empire by absorbing all their neighbors and destroying rules-based world order. Intentions that Russia openly and continuously repeated for decades. Unfortunately, Western Europe decided that if they ignore it hard enough and play along nicely, the problem will somehow solve itself. Well, it didn't. Instead, it led to Ukraine. And this is where we get to the core of the problem. Decades of disarmament and self-righteous pacifism in Western Europe led to a ridiculous situation where Western Europe had no proper militaries for conventional land war in Europe. Eastern Europe, which started to rearm as early as Crimean crisis, was also not doing that hot. Not because we did not want to protect ourselves. It's just that we are still trying to recover from decades of destructive and outright backward Soviet rule that destroyed our countries. As a result, Europe in 2022 was basically unprepared for conventional war like what is happening right now in Ukraine. Good thing Putin was dumb enough to go against second largest European country that was preparing for war with Russia for 8 years and not unprepared NATO. But if Western Europe was not prepared to meet and defeat Russia in the battlefield, why Putin decided to go for Ukraine and not Baltics or Poland? Simple. USA. Because as weak and unprepared Western Europe might have been, USA air power alone most likely would have wrecked conventional Russian military in a matter of days. It happened in Iraq, Yugoslavia, Libya, all of which had Russian-style military assets. So, the USA had a lot of experience on how to deal with it. And don't get me even started on complete and utter USA superiority on land and sea. Russia knew that if it touches NATO and USA actually comes into rescue, final and utter destruction of Russian state as we know it will become reality. This is where we get to Trump. The thing is that the European NATO part has economy that is on par with the USA. UK, France, Germany, Italy, Poland, Czech Republic, Romania, and even the smaller countries have their own military industries. The European NATO part also has at least 100 million more people than the USA. And somehow, seemingly, Europe would not be able to defend itself against Russia? That always just blew my mind. Why 450 million Europeans must rely on 330 million Americans to defend them from the country of 140 million people that had a pre-war economy smaller than that of Italy or New York State? How stupid is that? What Trump did is that it forced Europe to look to its own security seriously for the first time in decades. And it is working. After decades of neglect, all NATO countries are starting to spend reasonable amounts of money on their militaries. Military-industrial complex is being renewed and, in some cases, outright rebuilt. Realization that Russia primarily fights prolonged attritional wars means that military production capabilities is the name of the game. And here, Russia cannot even remotely compete to the combined might of united Europe, and they know it. All these changes, in large part, are happening thanks to the ambiguity of what will happen to USA in NATO if Trump gets elected. And believe me, for someone living in Vilnius at basically artillery range from the Belarusian border, seeing how Europe is preparing to first deter and, if needed, to defend itself from possible Russian aggression, I cannot be happier. So, thank you, Trump, I guess. Now, I have to admit, I am not a huge fan of Trump. I do see how such presumed ambiguity also might encourage Putin to try what would happen if he would touch Eastern NATO countries. I mean, he already misjudged Ukrainian resolve to fight for freedom. What happens if he misjudges Trump's willingness to defend NATO countries? So, while the result of all of this is positive, some of the connotations are truly dangerous. Additionally, to be honest, I'm not even sure if this effect of Europe coming to its senses was something Trump or someone in the USA intended. All of this might just be a string of coincidences that just worked itself out in the end. Basically, task failed successfully type situation. Also, I believe that the USA benefits a lot from being in close military alliance with European democracies. One way or another, we are approaching the situation of the globalized world. And with authoritarian states such as Russia, China, and Iran starting to challenge current world order, democracies must stick together and be ready to remind the world why this way of life is the best. With this in mind, once again, a strong Europe is an asset for the USA in more ways than one. I would be really interested to know your opinions. How much of this was somehow deliberate action from Trump and Republicans, and how much of just internal USA politics influencing world events? Leave a comment down below. Other than that, that's it. Drop a like, subscribe if you haven't already, and I see you in the next one. Ciao!